Freddie Mercury told Jimmy Page to play piano as a joke. What happened next left him in tears. Freddie Mercury had just finished performing at a private charity gala when he turned to Jimmy Page and said something that was meant to be a joke. But what Jimmy did next left Freddie in tears and revealed a secret the Led Zeppelin guitarist had kept for 30 years. It was November 24th, 1985, at Abbey Road Studios in London. This wasn't your typical rock concert or massive public event. This was an intimate gathering for the Mercury Phoenix Trust, one of the most exclusive charity events of the year. Only 150 people were in attendance. VIP guests, musicians, celebrities, and major donors. The atmosphere was elegant, warm, and surprisingly relaxed. Queen had recently finished their Magic Tour, and this was one of Freddie's first private performances since the band's triumphant Live Aid appearance just months earlier. The evening had been magical. Freddie had performed several Queen classics on the grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys with the same theatrical mastery that had defined 2 decades of rock royalty. The audience was captivated, hanging on every dramatic flourish. Among those in attendance were some of the biggest names in music. But tucked away at a corner table, trying to stay out of the spotlight, sat Jimmy Page. He looked relaxed that night, wearing his signature dark blazer, his long dark hair falling around his shoulders. He'd been watching Freddie perform with the quiet intensity he was known for. They'd been acquaintances for over 15 years, surviving the wild excesses of the 70s together, watching each other navigate the pressures of superstardom. This wasn't about publicity or cameras. This was about supporting a cause they both believed in. As Freddie finished his final song of the evening, the room erupted in applause. He stood, took a theatrical bow, and began chatting with the audience in that wonderfully flamboyant way he had. He was in his element, telling stories, making people laugh, commanding the room with pure charisma. Then his eyes landed on Jimmy, and his face lit up with mischief. "Jimmy," Freddie called out, pointing across the room. "Jimmy Page, ladies and gentlemen. The wizard of Led Zeppelin himself is here tonight." The room turned to look. Jimmy waved politely, clearly not wanting the attention. But Freddie wasn't done. "Come up here, darling. Come on, don't be shy." Jimmy shook his head, but Freddie persisted, and the crowd started encouraging him. Reluctantly, Jimmy stood up and made his way to the front, with that measured, confident walk that had carried him across 1,000 stages. Freddie threw his arm around Jimmy's shoulder. "You know, Jimmy and I go way back. We've seen each other at our best and our worst. But there's one thing I've never seen Jimmy do." He paused for theatrical effect, his eyes twinkling with trademark Mercury mischief. "Jimmy, darling, why don't you play us something on the piano?" The room erupted in laughter. Everyone knew Jimmy's reputation. The master of the mystical, the guitar virtuoso, the man behind Stairway to Heaven. The idea of Jimmy Page playing classical piano seemed absurd, and that's exactly why Freddie said it. But something shifted in that moment. Jimmy didn't laugh. He stood there very still, and even in the dim lighting, you could see something change in his expression. The smile faded from Freddie's face as he noticed. The room went quiet. Jimmy turned to look at the grand piano, its polished black surface reflecting the chandelier lights above. His hands, usually so steady when holding a guitar, hung motionless at his sides. Then he looked at Freddie, and in his voice was a quiet intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Actually, Freddie, I think I will." The confusion in the room was palpable. Freddie's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, you're serious?" "Yeah," Jimmy said simply. "I am." He walked to the piano bench and sat down. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from something deeper, something that had been buried for 30 years. Freddie stood beside the piano, no longer jovial, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The room was completely silent now. You could hear someone's breathing, the clink of a glass being set down too carefully. To understand what happened next, you have to go back to Heston, West London, in the 1950s. Jimmy Page was born into a working-class family. His father was an industrial chemist, his mother a secretary. They lived modestly, but they believed in giving their son opportunities. When Jimmy was 7 years old, his mother, Patricia, made a decision that would shape his entire life. She arranged for him to take piano lessons with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who taught classical piano from her home near their neighborhood. For 3 years, from age 7 to 10, Jimmy studied classical piano. He learned proper technique, music theory, how to read notation. He played pieces by Bach, Chopin, and Beethoven. His small fingers moved across the keys with surprising dexterity and understanding. But when Jimmy discovered the guitar at age 12, everything changed. The guitar offered something the piano couldn't: rebellion, freedom, the sound of rock and roll. He abandoned his classical training and never looked back. His mother, Patricia, never complained. She understood that music was music, and if her son found his voice through the guitar, that was enough. But there was one piece she'd always loved hearing him play: a Chopin nocturne that he'd mastered when he was 9 years old. In 1971, Patricia Page was diagnosed with cancer. The treatments were brutal, and the prognosis wasn't good. Jimmy, at the height of Led Zeppelin's success, spent as much time as he could at her bedside. One afternoon, when it was just the two of them in the hospital room, Patricia made a request. "Jimmy, would you play that Chopin piece for me, just once more?" Jimmy's heart broke. "Mum, I haven't played piano in 20 years. I don't remember how." "Your fingers remember," she said softly. "Music like that doesn't leave you." Jimmy arranged for a small electronic keyboard to be brought to her room. He sat beside her bed, placed his hands on the keys, and tried to remember. The piece came back slowly, imperfectly. But it came back. When he finished, there were tears streaming down both their faces. "That was beautiful, Jimmy. You never lost it. You just forgot you had it." Patricia Page died 3 days later. Jimmy was holding her hand. Since that day in the hospital, Jimmy had never played piano in front of anyone. It was too private, too sacred. That moment had belonged to him and his mother, and that's where it would stay. Until tonight, at Abbey Road Studios, Jimmy placed his hands on the keys. He took a deep breath, and then he began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the elegant room. It wasn't the rock version everyone might have expected. This was pure classical piano, delicate, emotional, technically demanding. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace that nobody in that room had ever associated with the Jimmy Page they knew. Freddie Mercury stood frozen beside the piano, his hand covering his mouth. He understood now. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about something much deeper. Jimmy played with his eyes closed, and as he did, his lips moved, forming words that the audience couldn't hear but could somehow feel. He was talking to his mother. Across the years, across the divide between life and death, he was keeping a connection alive. The piece built to its emotional climax, Jimmy's left hand providing the deep, resonant bass notes, while his right hand danced through the delicate melody. The room remained in absolute silence, except for the piano and the quiet intensity of Jimmy's performance. When he played the final note, something happened that no one in that room would ever forget. Jimmy stayed seated, his hands still resting on the keys, and his shoulders began to shake. Jimmy Page, the man who had survived everything rock and roll could throw at him, who had played in front of millions, who had become a legend precisely because nothing seemed to touch him, was crying. Freddie immediately moved to his side, kneeling beside the piano bench and placing a gentle hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Jimmy, mate, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Jimmy shook his head, unable to speak at first. Finally, he managed. "Nobody knew. That's how she wanted it. Private, just us." Freddie helped Jimmy to his feet, and the sight of these two rock legends, one comforting the other in a moment of pure vulnerability, was something no one present would ever forget. After a few moments, Freddie gently took the microphone. His voice was thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this foundation, everything we do here tonight, it's about love. It's about family. It's about keeping promises to the people who matter most. Tonight, Jimmy just showed us what that really means." He paused, looking at Jimmy, who was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief someone had given him. "I'm making a personal donation of £50,000 to this foundation tonight in the name of Patricia Page. And I'm designating it specifically for music education programs for children who can't afford lessons." The room erupted in applause, but Freddie wasn't finished. "Jimmy, your mother gave the world an incredible gift when she gave you music. Let's give that gift to other children." What happened next was extraordinary. Roger Taylor, who had been seated in the audience, stood up and pledged £10,000. Other musicians and donors followed. By the end of the evening, the room had collectively donated over £200,000. The Patricia Page Music Education Fund was born. Jimmy was overwhelmed. He stood shakily and spoke into the microphone for the first time that evening. His voice was rough, broken, but clear. "My mother worked as a secretary her whole life. She never had luxury, never got to do the grand things she dreamed of. But she gave me everything. She believed in me when I was just a kid making noise in my bedroom." He paused, composing himself. "She would have loved this. She would have loved that her name is going to help kids learn music. Thank you, Freddie. Thank you, everyone." The evening ended not with more performances, but with something more meaningful. People approached Jimmy not for autographs or photos, but to share their own stories. Stories about promises made to parents. Stories about dreams deferred. Stories about the sacrifices mothers and fathers make for their children. The guitar hero had become something else that night. A son honoring his mother, and everyone in that room felt the profound truth of that moment. The story could have ended there. But in today's world, privacy is fleeting. A few of the guests shared the story respectfully on social media. They didn't share videos of Jimmy's performance out of respect, but they shared the story, and it spread. Within days, the hashtag Patricia's Legacy was trending worldwide. People shared stories about their own mothers, their own musical journeys. Musicians posted videos of themselves playing piano in honor of Patricia Page. The Patricia Page Music Education Fund launched officially 3 months later. The program provided free piano lessons and instruments to children from low-income families. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Music schools volunteered their teachers. Piano manufacturers donated instruments. Within the first year, Patricia's music reached over 3,000 children across the UK. 6 months after that night at Abbey Road, something happened that brought Jimmy back to the piano one more time. It was the first Patricia's Music graduation recital, where 40 children who had been in the program for 6 months would perform for their families. Jimmy and Freddie were both special guests. Among the performers was a 10-year-old boy named David, whose single mother worked 2 jobs to support them. David had shown remarkable talent. and his teacher had suggested he perform Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major as his recital piece. When Jimmy heard this, he asked if he could join David on stage. That afternoon, in a small community center in West London, not far from where Jimmy had grown up, he sat beside young David at the piano and played harmony to the boy's melody. David's small fingers moved confidently across the keys, and Jimmy played the supporting bass notes, creating a beautiful duet that brought the entire audience to tears. After the performance, Freddie pulled Jimmy aside. "Your mother would be so proud, darling. You know that, right?" Jimmy nodded, watching David show off his certificate to his mother. "That joke you made at Abbey Road, I think it was the best thing that ever happened. She's helping kids now, all these kids. That's what she always wanted, for people to have chances she never had." Today, Patricia's music has expanded to over 15 countries and has helped more than 20,000 children learn piano. Jimmy doesn't perform the Nocturne publicly at concerts. He still won't. But every year at the annual Mercury Phoenix Trust Gala, there's a moment set aside. The lights dim, a piano is brought out, and Jimmy Page plays Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major in honor of his mother and all the children learning music in her name. It's become a tradition, a sacred moment in an evening full of celebration. Freddie Mercury, before his death in 1991, called it the most beautiful thing I ever witnessed. The story of that night reminds us of something important. Behind every larger-than-life figure, behind every rock legend and wild personality, is someone's child. Someone who made a promise to their mother or father and carries it with them, even when the world sees only the fame and the persona. A joke meant to entertain became a promise fulfilled, a mother honored, and thousands of children given the gift she had given her son decades earlier. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when you think you know everything about someone, they surprise you with a grace and depth that reminds you why music matters. Jimmy still has that small electronic keyboard from the hospital in 1971. It sits in his home studio, and sometimes, when he's alone, he plays just for her, just to keep the conversation going, because some promises aren't made to be kept once. They're made to be kept forever.